Picture this: Spain in the late 15th century, a land of knights and inquisitors. Out of this chaotic land rise two royals whose marriage wasn't just a romantic happily ever after, but more of a political nuclear fusion. Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon. Their union didn't just unite Spain, it launched a dynasty that would gobble up half the globe. Their heirs? Oh, only the Habsburgs, those chin-heavy, jaw-dropping aristocrats who ruled not just Spain, but the Holy Roman Empire, Italy, the Netherlands, and even part of the Americas. Charles V and Philip II were not just monarchs, they were Renaissance supervillains in silk tights, scheming, warring, and hoarding more land than anyone really needs. Welcome back to Epic Renaissance. Today, we're pulling back the velvet curtains on Spanish royalty during the Renaissance, and trust me, what we're about to uncover will make your favorite reality TV show look tame. But before we spill all this royalty and uncover the biggest secrets, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because if you love juicy historical secrets as much as we do, you won't want to miss what's coming up on this channel. In the late 1400s, Spain didn't yet exist as we know it today. Instead, you've got a patchwork of kingdoms constantly at each other's throats. You had Castile, the biggest and richest kingdom, Aragon, with its Mediterranean empire, Navarre, a little mountain kingdom, and Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia. But then, something happened that would transform this chaotic landscape into the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. And it all started with a secret marriage that scandalized Europe. Let's start with Isabella of Castile. Clever, stubborn, and ambitious. A woman so ahead of her time that she made most Renaissance men look like amateurs, and so ruthless that she made Cersei Lannister look like Mother Teresa. Born in 1451, Isabella wasn't supposed to inherit anything. She was the spare heir, the backup plan, the understudy who was never supposed to take the stage. But when her half-brother King Henry IV died under mysterious circumstances, Isabella found herself in the most powerful position in Castile. Now, here's where it gets scandalous. Isabella's secret weapon wasn't an army or a treasury. It was her marriage to Ferdinand II of Aragon. But this wasn't some romantic love story. This was political maneuvering at its finest, and it nearly started a war before it even happened. The couple met in secret in 1469, when Isabella was just 18. Ferdinand was 17, charming, and most importantly, he controlled Aragon, the perfect complement to Isabella's Castile. But here's the kicker. They were second cousins, which meant they needed papal permission to marry. Pope Paul II refused, so what did they do? They forged the papal bill. That's right, the future Catholic Monarchs started their reign with a massive fraud that could have gotten them excommunicated. But here's the kicker. Isabella and Ferdinand didn't just unite kingdoms, they shared power. Unusual for the time, Isabella wasn't content to play the role of the obedient wife. She was a ruler in her own right, signing decrees alongside Ferdinand. Together, they were branded the Catholic Monarchs by the Pope himself. Oh, speaking of God, let's talk about the Spanish Inquisition. Because, yes, Isabella and Ferdinand literally created one of history's most notorious institutions. In 1478, they established the Spanish Inquisition and appointed the infamous Tomás de Torquemada as Grand Inquisitor. Here's what your history textbook probably didn't tell you. 1492 was also the year of the Spanish Inquisition's most infamous act, expelling the Jews. That meant tens of thousands of Jewish families, many of whom were scholars, merchants, and bankers, were forced to convert, flee, or face torture. Ferdinand and Isabella framed it as a means of protecting Christian unity and religious purity. In reality, it was also about confiscating wealth and consolidating power. When they expelled or converted Jews and Muslims, the crown confiscated their property. We're talking about a systematic wealth grab disguised as religious zealotry. The Catholic monarchs literally funded their empire by stealing from religious minorities. Another important event, the Reconquista. For centuries, Christians and Muslims had fought over Iberia, and by 1492, Granada was the last Muslim kingdom standing. Isabella and Ferdinand rolled in with armies, cannons, and a sense of divine mission. When Granada finally fell, they made sure to pose for all the paintings, looking holy, righteous, and just a little smug. Now, here's what everyone knows the Catholic monarchs for. Isabella funded Christopher Columbus, but the real story is way more interesting than the sanitized version you learned in school. When Columbus first approached the Spanish court in 1486, Isabella and Ferdinand rejected his proposal. Not once, but twice. The guy was asking for insane terms. He wanted to be made admiral of the ocean sea, viceroy of all lands he discovered, and a 10% cut of all wealth from the New World forever. So why did Isabella eventually say yes? Here's the secret. She was desperate. The conquest of Granada had drained the royal treasury. Columbus wasn't her first choice. He was her Hail Mary pass. Now, here's the juicy part. Ferdinand was notorious for philandering. He had mistresses, illegitimate children, and all the drama you'd expect from a king with too much free time. Isabella, meanwhile, was deeply pious and constantly pregnant. She bore 5 surviving children, each married off strategically across Europe. These royal kids would tie Spain to Portugal, England, the Holy Roman Empire, and beyond. Their daughter Joanna, later known as Joanna the Mad, would inherit Castile and marry into the Habsburg dynasty, planting the seed for Spain's future as a superpower. So Isabella and Ferdinand weren't just rulers, they were dynastic architects, building a family tree so sprawling and entangled that centuries later it would produce kings who couldn't close their mouths properly. And that's where the real story begins, because their heirs would turn Spain into the first global empire. When Isabella and Ferdinand's grandson Charles inherited their thrones in 1516, nobody expected him to become the most powerful ruler in European history. Born in 1500 in Ghent, in what's now Belgium, Charles grew up speaking Flemish and French. He barely knew Spanish when he arrived to claim his inheritance. The Spanish nobility were so horrified by their foreign-born king that they literally revolted. Thanks to some truly Olympic-level dynastic marriage planning, he inherited more titles than any sane man should want. From his mother, Joanna of Castile, he got Spain and its American colonies. From his father, Philip the Handsome, a Habsburg, he got the Low Countries, Austria, and eventually the title of Holy Roman Emperor in 1519. Oh, and let's not forget Naples, Sicily, and parts of North Africa. By his early 20s, Charles ruled so much land that people joked the sun never set on his empire. But being emperor wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. It was more like babysitting 500 angry children, all screaming in different languages. His reign was a non-stop war zone. Protestants were rebelling in Germany. The French were his eternal enemies. The Ottomans were threatening Europe. And in Spain, people were constantly broke, despite galleons full of silver arriving from the Americas. Charles was smart, disciplined, and devoutly Catholic. He fought tirelessly to keep Europe united under his crown and his religion. And let's not forget the New World. Under Charles, conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro toppled the Aztec and Inca empires, funneling mountains of gold and silver into Spain. Juicy detail. Most of that treasure didn't stay in Spain. It went right back out to pay for Charles's endless wars. Spain was rich on paper, but constantly bankrupt. Now let's talk about something your history teacher definitely didn't mention. The Habsburgs were obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure, which is a polite way of saying they married their relatives. A lot. Charles V's parents were cousins, his grandparents were cousins, and his great-grandparents were, you guessed it, cousins. The result? The famous Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw that made eating and speaking difficult. Charles had it, his son Philip II had it even worse. And by the time we get to Charles II of Spain a century later, the poor guy couldn't even chew solid food. But here's the secret the Habsburg court tried to hide. This wasn't just about appearance. The inbreeding caused serious health problems throughout the dynasty. Here's something that'll blow your mind. Charles V essentially lived multiple lives simultaneously. In Spain, he was the Catholic king, defender of the faith against Protestant heretics. In Germany, he was the Holy Roman Emperor, trying to keep Protestant princes from tearing the empire apart. In Italy, he was the Renaissance patron, competing with the Pope for cultural influence. In the Americas, he was the distant overlord of vast territories he'd never even seen. The psychological toll was enormous. Charles developed what we now recognize as severe anxiety and depression. He would sometimes disappear from public life for weeks at a time, claiming illness but actually suffering from what appears to have been a mental health crisis. His private letters reveal a man constantly worried about money, rebellions, and the weight of ruling half the world. In 1527, Charles's armies did something that shocked all of Europe. They sacked Rome and held the Pope prisoner. Now, Charles claimed that this was an accident, that his troops got out of control and he was horrified by their actions. But secret diplomatic correspondences suggest otherwise. Charles was furious with Pope Clement VII for opposing his policies and supporting France. The accidental sack of Rome was remarkably convenient timing, and it forced the Pope to crown Charles as Holy Roman Emperor and support his divorce proceedings against Henry VIII of England. Sometimes the best way to negotiate with the Vatican is to accidentally conquer it. The most shocking moment of Charles's reign wasn't a battle or a conquest. It was his decision to give it all up. In 1556, at the height of his power, in one of the most dramatic mic drops in history, Charles V abdicated. He literally walked away from being the most powerful man in the world. After decades of nonstop ruling, Charles was exhausted. He began suffering from gout so bad that he could barely move. Charles split his empire. He gave the Holy Roman Empire to his brother Ferdinand, and Spain, with all its colonies, to his son Philip. The official story was that he was tired and wanted to spend his final years in religious contemplation, but the real reason was darker. Charles was having what we now call a complete nervous breakdown. The pressure of ruling such a vast empire, dealing with constant rebellions, fighting endless wars, and managing chronic health problems had broken him mentally. He split his empire between his son, Philip II, who got Spain and its territories, and his brother Ferdinand, who got Austria and the Holy Roman Empire. Then he retreated to a monastery in Spain, where he spent his final years obsessively winding and rewinding clocks. A perfect metaphor for a man who had tried to control time itself. Now let's talk about Charles's successor, his son Philip II of Spain, who was born in 1527. If Charles was a warrior emperor, Philip was, well, a workaholic. If Charles V was obsessed with control, his son Philip II took it to pathological levels. Philip ruled from a desk, literally. He spent most of his 42-year reign sitting in a small office in the Escorial Palace, a massive palace monastery he built outside Madrid. He inherited Spain, its American colonies, Naples, Milan, the Netherlands, and eventually Portugal. At one point, he ruled more territory than any monarch in history. Philip's attention to detail was legendary and completely insane. He was the Renaissance equivalent of the guy who insists on managing every detail of the office Christmas party and then burns the place down. He would spend hours correcting the grammar in diplomatic correspondence. He once delayed a military campaign by 3 weeks because he was personally reviewing the inventory of tent stakes. This wasn't just royal eccentricity, it was a system of government that guaranteed inefficiency. Military commanders would wait months for responses to urgent requests because Philip was too busy editing their spelling. The Spanish Empire was literally being run by a perfectionist with severe control issues. Philip II was married 4 times, and here's something that'll make you raise an eyebrow. 3 of his wives died under mysterious circumstances, and the 4th went insane. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, died immediately after giving birth to their son, Don Carlos. His second wife, Mary I of England, yes, Bloody Mary, their marriage briefly made him King of England. But after Mary died after a phantom pregnancy, he lost the title. His third wife, Elizabeth of France, died suddenly after a miscarriage. He also proposed to Elizabeth I of England, yes, the Virgin Queen, but she turned him down with legendary sass. The most tragic and scandalous story of Philip's reign involves his son and heir Don Carlos. The prince was troubled. Born with physical deformities, thanks to that Habsburg inbreeding, Don Carlos was violent, unstable, and increasingly hostile to his father's policies. Here's where it gets really dark. In 1568, Philip had his own son arrested and imprisoned. The official story was that Don Carlos was plotting treason and planning to flee to the Netherlands to join Protestant rebels. But the real story, pieced together from court documents and diplomatic correspondence, suggests that father and son were locked in psychological battle that destroyed them both. Don Carlos died in prison 6 months later, officially from natural causes, but the circumstances were so suspicious that rumors of murder spread across Europe. Philip's enemies claimed that he had killed his own son, while Philip's supporters insisted the prince died from his own excesses. The truth we'll probably never know. Now let's talk about the infamous Spanish Armada incident in 1588, Philip's biggest gamble. One of Philip's obsessions was defending Catholicism. He saw himself as the sword of the Counter-Reformation, the man destined to crush Protestantism. Philip launched a massive fleet to invade England and overthrow Elizabeth I. Instead, storms, bad planning, and fierce English resistance turned the Armada into a floating disaster. Thousands of Spanish sailors drowned, and the myth of Spain's invincibility took a serious hit. Oh, but before we wrap up, let's spill the royal tea. First, Spain was constantly bankrupt. All that American silver, it didn't make Spain rich. Instead, it fueled inflation and was consumed by wars. By the 16th century, Spain had declared bankruptcy multiple times, even while ships were unloading treasure in Seville. Imagine winning the lottery every year and still maxing out your credit cards. Second, the inbreeding. The Habsburg dynasty was so obsessed with marrying cousins that by the 17th century, their descendants could barely function. The infamous Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, was so deformed and infertile, he became known as the Bewitched. That was the legacy of Isabella and Ferdinand's dynastic empire building. Third, the human cost. The Spanish monarchy's pursuit of religious unity fueled the Inquisition, which tortured and executed thousands. In the Americas, conquest brought death, disease, and cultural destruction on an apocalyptic scale. While Spain grew rich in art and architecture, sadly, millions of indigenous people paid the price. Now for the secret I promised to save for last, the one that still impacts your life today. It's not about gold or conquest or royal scandals. It's about something far more subtle and far more powerful, the Spanish royal creation of the first global economic system. When Isabella funded Columbus, when Charles V administered territories on 5 continents, when Philip II managed trade routes that circled the globe, they weren't just building an empire, they were creating the template for globalization. The Spanish model of extracting resources from colonies, processing them in Europe, and selling finished goods back to the colonies became the blueprint for every European empire that followed. But here's the kicker. The Spanish system was designed to benefit the crown above all else. Private merchants, colonial settlers, and especially indigenous peoples were all expendable in the service of royal profit. This model of extractive capitalism, where wealth flows from the periphery to the center, where labor is cheap and resources are exploited without regard for sustainability, is still the foundation of our global economy today. When you wonder why some countries are rich while others remain poor despite having abundant natural resources, you're seeing the legacy of the Spanish royal system. When you see multinational corporations extracting resources from developing countries while keeping the profits in wealthy nations, you're seeing a direct descendant of the Spanish colonial model. The Spanish royals didn't just conquer territory, they created a way of thinking about economics that prioritizes short-term extraction over long-term sustainability. And we're still living with the consequences today, from climate change to global inequality, to the boom and bust cycles that plague modern capitalism. We are still grappling with the aftershocks of the world that Isabella, Ferdinand, Charles, and Philip created. Their legacy lives on everywhere. Spanish became one of the world's most spoken languages. Catholicism spread across Latin America and the Philippines. The idea of global empires was born with Spain. So, there you have it. The Spanish royals of the Renaissance weren't the noble, pious rulers of legend. They were a dynasty of political masterminds, religious hypocrites, financial incompetents, and control freaks whose personal dramas shaped the modern world. If you enjoyed this dive into royal secrets, hit that subscribe button, because the Renaissance is filled with even more scandals, betrayals, and shocking truths waiting to be uncovered.